Hi, everyone. We're back, and we're going to have a different format for part of this afternoon. Instead of the usual panel approach with a lot of people speaking in the same panel, we wanted to spend some time talking to individuals who have done some extraordinary work over the past year, either scholarship or in best practices on criminal justice issues, to give them more of an opportunity to discuss and talk about what they've been doing and and orient questions towards them and their work especially. So for the first part of the our conversations segment, I want to introduce Professor Shytierra Gaston, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology at Georgia State. She has been a speaker, an esteemed speaker with us in previous sessions, but she has done some really interesting work this year on the effect of the impact of police diversity, including a paper she did recently on whether diversity has a direct effect on police misconduct. So I want to talk a little bit about that with her and introduce her, Dr. Shytierra. Dr. Gaston, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Steve, for having me. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, yes.
Perfect. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be back.
So let's start by you telling us talk a little bit about your paper and your findings and your methodology and what you found.
Absolutely. So this paper is published in the journal Criminology and Public Policy. I authored it alongside Matthew Teddy and Matheson Sanchez. And in this paper, we revisited the ongoing question about the potential role of racial representation in policing and its potential impact on important policing outcomes. And in the case of our study, specifically police killings, especially along racial and ethnic lines. So specifically, we examined whether racial representation, racial composition of police departments matched the racial composition of the jurisdictions that they policed, and whether that racial congruence between the police and the communities decreased or had any impact on racialized fatal force among Black, white, and Hispanic victims. So this question about racial representation in policing is an ongoing question. It has been examined previously in research. And one of the motivations for the study was to address this ongoing policy recommendation that police departments need to be diversified in order to improve outcomes such as racialized police killings. That recommendation has been offered for many decades. I mean, the 1967 President's Commission, the Obama administration in their report, this was a recommendation as well. And usually when we have high profile police killings or these other police crises that have happened in recent decades, this is a common recommendation. Now, in prior studies, those studies were primarily conducted at the level. So they examined whether individual officer race had any impact on their encounters with individuals of color. And those generally show that officer race has no significant impact on improving policing outcomes. However, in our study, we decided to examine the research question at a different level of analysis by paying attention to police departments. And that is a completely different research question at a different level of analysis. We put together a unique set using various data sources for a sample of 1,988 local police departments. We examined whether their racial composition in 2010 matched that of the communities or specifically the jurisdictions that they were responsible for that year, and whether that racial congruence had any impact on the rate of police killings by race between 2013 and 2018. We found a significant relationship between racial congruence of police departments and the relationship and racialized fatal force. Specifically, we found the strongest reduction among Black Americans. We found that police departments that had greater Black racial congruence, basically the percentage of Black officers relative to the percentage of Black Americans in the community, had a greater reduction in killing Black Americans in the community. We also found a reduction in fatal force among agencies that were Hispanic congruent. So agencies that were Hispanic representative of the communities that they serve had a lower risk of killing Hispanic civilians. And we didn't find a specific impact of Black racial congruence or racial congruence white victims. So in conclusion, the study learned or revealed, I should say, that for at least some local police departments in the country, increasing the representation of Black and Hispanic officers might lower police killings of Black and Hispanic victims. And in some cases, we found in some supplemental analyses also for white Americans as well. But this is especially true when that diversity mirrors that of the communities that agencies serve.
First, a methodological question, Dr. Gaston. Were you looking at urban police departments in particular, or rural, or a mixture of both?
So we did not constrict our sample based on rural urban characteristics. We drew our data from the data set, and that data set starts with a representative sample of about 2,800 police departments. Usually some of the larger police forces, but they are pretty much inclusive of some of the urban and rural places as well.
And you related it to the proportion that Black and brown members of the force responded to the same proportionality in the community, or what was the relation between the two? Sorry, did you hear? Are you with me there? Hello.
Percentage of officers of color relative
Yes.
to the percentage of the communities or the jurisdictions they're responsible for. And then for our race measure, that comes from a completely different data set, the Mapping Police Violence data set. And we examined the race of victims that were killed by police during that time period.
So how do you, what's your explanation for that? I mean, the idea has been that it really doesn't matter whether you're Black or brown. Once you get into the police force, you begin to be imbued with the culture of the police force. And it doesn't really necessarily matter that you're Black or brown. You see the world in much the same eyes as you would, as anyone else would. So how do you explain that, the difference in figures?
Yeah, so this is a matter of institution versus individual. And policing is largely, individual factors matter, of course, but policing is a largely institutional practice. So what we're finding at the institutional level, when agencies are racially diverse, they appear to improve the outcomes along racial lines when it comes to fatal police violence. If we were to examine the study at the individual level, look at individual officers, we probably would not find that same finding. So it's something about police organizations that are diverse that leads to these more favorable outcomes.
Do you think it's a change of culture, or that just having a more diverse force implicitly changes the culture and the approach of an agency, or are there other factors involved?
We do not know. And in our paper, we call for additional research that can examine mechanisms to better understand the relationship between racial representation and reduced racialized policing. So it could be improved police-citizen trust, because some of the literature suggests that in any organization, irrespective of police or whether it's education or any other organization, that when we have a bureaucracy, that may lead to more favorable outcomes among the people that they serve, right?
Mm-hmm,
and that may be because of increased trust, increased legitimacy. It could be a matter of differential policing styles. It could be a number of factors that need to be further investigated.
That's fascinating. What's your feeling, though, personally? What do you make of your findings?
Yeah, so I will first say, I know one of the temptations is to take away that more diverse police forces leads to better outcomes. And I think we should be cautious about that and how we make sense of the research findings, especially given that our sample is not representative of the United States. We have a good sample of a little less than 2,000 agencies. And for those particular agencies, we're seeing these patterns. I think we should also be cautious and realize that increased racial diversity or representation, I should say, specifically, is not a panacea for addressing police problems.
Mhm.
So it could be a matter of policy, it could be a matter of police culture, it could be some third variable that we were not able to tap into. So as I see it, this is just one piece of this broader puzzle of what we need to do to think about how to reduce fatal force, especially fatal force that is racialized. Also, our study shows reductions in racialized fatal force, not the eliminated. So I think agencies and researchers as well should think about ways to eliminate the racism in fatal force.
So even though there's a lot we still don't know from your, and obviously there's a lot more research that has to be done, but what policy recommendations do you think arise from what you found so far?
So one recommendation is to invest more research and more attention to agencies that do it right. So I think there's
What do you mean do it right? Do you mean hire a more diverse group?
So I mean in terms of the outcome. So in the policing literature, there's this emphasis on bad policing, and that of course needs to be investigated, of course. But there are some agencies that exist, at least one in this country, that has more favorable outcomes that are our goals. So that may be an agency that has more equitable police stops, more racially equitable police stops, less racist or racialized police killings. And maybe we can turn attention to those agencies that are right in terms of producing the outcomes that the nation says that we want to address, and figure out what they are doing and how can what they're doing be applied to other places as well. So basically use them as a model.
The irony is that we had a panel earlier today where we had Dr. Elsie Scott on. I don't know if you know her from Howard University, who has done several surveys over time of African-American students. She's at a historically Black college, as you know, and she asked them would they be interested in taking a career in law enforcement. And her earlier survey suggested they would. I think it was the first survey was about 10 years ago. Then a later survey made clear that most of them wouldn't. And one reason is because of their own experiences, adverse experiences at the hands of police. So it's ironic that having more, in this case, African Americans in the police force might reduce the use of fatal force, but it's less likely that African American youth will make law enforcement a career. I mean, obviously there are other issues, pay, career advancement, which have nothing to do with race at all, that affects how people will go into law enforcement as a career. But I wonder how you react to that. It's a bit of an irony to find that those two results.
Yeah, I mean, the results and the decline is not surprising to me. One thing I will add is that, there's an emphasis on hiring, which is one aspect, but another important aspect is retention. So agencies have to work to do a good job of retaining the officers of color that they currently have, right, maximizing the resources that they have. And some of that involves addressing the pre-existing culture of policing. There's a reason why some police departments are more diverse than others. There are historical factors, there are political factors, there are cultural factors that have excluded color from the profession. So those are some issues that need to be addressed, and not just bringing them in.
Where would you go next? Where is your research going to take you next?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch.
Where's your research? What's your next step in researching this?
Yeah, so to be very honest, I was very surprised by the findings because I thought we would find, results that echoed some of the individual studies. So I'm very curious to know how these patterns might play out in other types of. So do we see a reduction in racialized stops? Do we see a reduction in racialized arrests? Or is it just something specific about the violence? And we have some pre-existing data that can tap into those questions. Now, there are a lot of data constraints that prevent us from studying some of the other issues that we probably should be looking at, such as the mechanisms that lead relationships. There should probably be some qualitative studies to especially hone in on those agencies that are racially congruent, that have reduced racialized policing, to look at them as a sort of model. to figure out some ways that we can apply what they're doing to other agencies to also reduce fatal force there.
There's a question, interesting question from in our Q&A from one of our journalists who says, how do you distinguish causation from correlation here? In other words, can you actually say that because can you make the connection, or is it just circumstantial that in one case you have a more diverse force and you have less police killings, or is that just, the temper of the times, relation to the politics of the day, or whatever else? How do we know that it's more than that it's a direct cause?
So we can't make causal claims here because this is a correlational study. It is a multivariate study. We did control for a number of factors that should be associated with both racial representation and racialized force. So we did control for community characteristics such as crime, economic disadvantage, and the racial makeup. And we also controlled for a number of organizational characteristics such as the size of the police force, such as various policies related to the use of force,
right,
etc. So here we can't make, because it's not, an experimental design. So we can only say associations related to, we see reductions.
So you've been looking at policing in a lot of other directions as part of your career. Do you have any sort of bottom line impressions right now about the level and the willingness for reform among the law enforcement agencies that you are looking at? I mean, has there been change in the time that you started to research this? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so in recent years, I think there's been a relatively quick change in public sentiment about policing and the public's appetite for police reform. In recent years, we've even gone as far as talking about defunding the police, abolishing the police. Now, those movements have been around, so those are not new movements, contrary to popular belief. But I feel like there's more, there has been a major shift in recent years to reevaluate the way we do policing. And I think this is actually a further time to reconsider some of the ways we might police. I was in a panel prior to mine, and they were talking about relying more on mental health specialists instead of the police when dealing with mental health crises. So those sorts of conversations are more popular now than they were just a few years ago.
The interesting point that the reporter also wanted to make was whether the prevalence of violence in the community had also a factor or involved a factor in terms of the kinds of, the use of force, fatal force by police.
That's the narrative. So
that is the narrative. Yes,
it's a narrative. I have conducted multiple studies of police force, examining different types of research questions for theoretical purposes, and we don't always find consistently that police force happens neighborhoods with high violence. Actually, sometimes we find the opposite. And that may be because those neighborhoods have a different racial composition, and there are theories about the use of police to maintain the interests of the white ruling class residents, but we don't always find that relationship in a way that's consistent.
So a big question at the heart of looking at officer-involved shootings and violence is legitimacy. The question is whether, if you have a force that feels legitimate in a community, or the community feels it's legitimate, you'd have less violence, less tension, less conflict, theoretically. How does diversity enter into that? In other words, does having a more diverse force, do you think, increase legitimacy of an individual agency, as opposed to, say, having a community policing approach, or do the two have to work together? Hard questions. I don't know whether research shows that, but it'd be worth looking at.
Yeah, our findings can't speak to that directly, but I think it's important to also just keep differentiating between the individual level versus the agency level. So even in the prior studies, for example, one of they don't find a relationship between individual officer race and improved outcomes is because some residents report that officers of color are as aggressive or sometimes more aggressive than white officers, right?
Right.
But we're talking about a police force that's diverse and maybe has a totally different orientation that could have an impact on the community than the individual officers. So in terms of legitimacy, we could talk about at the individual officer level, or we could talk about the legitimacy of the police force in those communities and the relationship that agency has with the broader community beyond just the individual level factors.
Does the management of the agency have anything to do with that? If you have an African American or Hispanic at the top of the or near the top in senior leadership ranks, does that make a difference? Do you think? I mean, we'll certainly see whether that's true. We can, I guess, research will tell us a little bit more because it's been around for there've been Asian American, African American, Hispanic American chiefs, for the last little while, and we can probably track the level of officer-involved shootings in those agencies.
Yeah, we were. That is a great question. We wonder the same. Unfortunately, with the wave of the Lima's data we encountered. We did have a variable for the race of the police chief. Unfortunately, that data, that variable had a lot of missing data. And if we were to include it, it would have biased our results because we would have had to exclude at least a third of our sample. So we weren't able to include that there, but there are other methodologies that could be conducted to better understand the relationship between race of police leadership and these improved outcomes. So more work needs to be done in that area. For sure.
So I mean, I hesitate about pushing beyond what your research shows, but I am interested in filling out what you think, your impression from what you've seen so far about why this might be true. Is it because having a much more cross-cultural environment in policing changes the approach to a community's problems, or is it a question of younger police are more involved, more and less likely to take traditional responses, violent responses to unarmed civilians, or what? I mean, what do you think are some of the factors here that we should think about?
It could be a matter of, again, increased citizen trust. It could be that these are, and something we didn't look longitudinally at the racial composition of agencies, right? So we don't know if these agencies are newly racially congruent, right, or if they have long-standing.
That was going to be my other questions, how long they've been.
Yeah, so I mean, that could be a factor. So if an agency has been a long-standing agency that has been racially congruent, that have a difference on the culture of the police in there and their relationship with the community that they serve. So we weren't able to parse that out with the type of data that we have, but that could be one of many factors.
Looking, are there other questions out there? Please put them in your in the Q&A window. I'm thinking particularly of the Hispanic. I don't know if you zeroed in on that, whether having a multilingual policeman or Asian American policeman helps at all in terms of increasing the legitimacy of a police force in a given neighborhood. Obviously, it's not relevant in the case of African Americans, but if you have in a place like Dallas or in states like New Mexico, where there's a huge Spanish-speaking population, does having people who speak the same language, come from the same culture, have any impact on the likelihood of using force or fatal force?
That's something
that's a guess
that our data can't speak to, but there are prior studies that look at other forms of diversity beyond race. Race is just one of many factors. So there's gender, there's education level, there's linguistics, and there are some studies that suggest that language might be a factor that can help improve, if not legitimate, these relationships between the police and the community. So in the case for some Hispanic areas, there may be a factor there. And that might be one of the reasons.
We have a sound problem because you're I don't know if you can hear me, but your audio is cutting in and out. Let me try again. Hang on. Gaston, can you hear me? Because I can't hear you.
I think it's a connection issue, Steve.
Yeah, that's what I think it is. I think the connection is bad because I'm not hearing everything Dr. Gaston is saying. Oh, well, I think we're just about at the end of our discussion. These were meant to be short, lightning discussions, so I think I'll I'll stop it there. If somebody has questions for Dr. Gaston, please put them in the Q&A window and I'll get them to her. And I hope she'll stay around with us during this hour, and we'll move to our next conversation in 5 minutes or so. Is our next speaker checked in yet? Maurice?
No,
No, not
he's
yet.
not due
Okay.
we're not due for 10 minutes, so.
For 10 minutes. Okay, so we'll take a quick break and we'll come back in about 10 minutes and try to figure out what the issue was here. Hang on. Ah, there she is. You're back. I think we're having audio problems, Dr. Gaston, which is why I can't hear you very well. Can you hear me well?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Your voice cuts in and out. I think there's a connection problem at your end. But no worries. I mean, if we can't solve it, but I just don't want to lose you completely. But while I do have you, if you can hear me, no, you've gone off screen again. Oh well, this is our first technological problem of the day, so I guess we were due for one. Can you still hear me? You want to try again? No. No, you're muted now. Just unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Do you want to give us a sort of a closing argument about where you think the research should go?
I didn't hear the last part. I'm sorry.
Give us a closing argument about where you think the research should go now, and you talked a little bit about what you're doing next.
Yeah. So in terms of, I think it's wild to think about, the practical implications. And again, I want to emphasize that increased representation among police forces is not a panacea. There are many other factors to this equation, and many other considerations that must be considered in order to improve police. So I want to definitely emphasize that. Also want to emphasize that hiring more officers of color is just one of many aspects. Another aspect is improving retention, improving inclusivity within the organization. So non-diversity, but also equity and inclusion. When we're talking about improving racial representation, that means the organization has to adjust. So, I mean, this is true of any organization. Want to bring in more diversity, you can't keep the pre-existing culture in place. There has to be shared resources, shared institutional power, officers of color coming in at all ranks, I should say, not just at the entry level rank. They should be represented in decision-making and policy, practices, etc. And also just the effort of creating a culture of anti-racism and anti-sexism within the forces, which helps with retention, also helps with the culture of inclusivity. So this is beyond just diversity and putting Black and brown faces into these departments.
Right.
Real change for this.
So just the last question here, and I hope we can hear you, if you can hear me. How can journalists use your research to improve their coverage of police, and in what way?
I think one matter journalists might consider is nuance and not oversimplifying research findings, because these matters can be rather complex and they're not always generalizable. So I interviewed with a journalist recently, and I really appreciated how she was very thorough with the study and the limitations and what could and could not be said about the results. So here, we have another sample. We have a sizable sample of almost 2,000 of police forces. So for those police forces, we're seeing these patterns, but we may or may not see them for other types of police forces. So just being mindful of the nuance and the level of detail.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Gaston. I wish we had a better audio connection, but I think we got most of it. And I'm going to put your contacts in our contact list so a journalist can contact you afterwards if they have questions or I want to delve a little bit deeper into what you've done. But congratulations on your research and good luck as you continue.
Thank you, Steve. Take care.
Thank you. And we'll take a quick 5-minute break and then we'll come back for our next conversation.